Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. Thank you for listening and being here and being who you are. I'm so grateful for you, and I am hoping that these episodes are impactful in your life for your healing, your growth, to open and expand you, that you feel seen, heard, understood in a way that helps equip you with information and another perspective. In this week's episode, we are talking all things on separation and divorce, the kinds of divorce, types of separation, the terms, the pros and cons of each. We talk about children and what's in the best interest of the children. So if you are walking through a divorce or a separation or struggling in your relationship and just need more information, this is the podcast for you. Or you might want to pass it along to a family member or a friend or coworker or neighbor. If it's helpful in any way, please pass it along. We need support when we're going through separation or a divorce. So let me tell you a little bit more about my guest. Jamie Davis is a North Carolina board-certified family law specialist and partner in the family firm Gaylor, Hunt, Jenkins, Davis, Taylor, and Gibbs, PLLC in Raleigh, North Carolina. She earned her bachelor's degree in political science and English and her law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Jamie's practice incorporates all areas of family law with a concentration in complex, equitable distribution and child custody matters, including relocation and interstate cases. She also has written a book, A Year and a Day, A Divorce Without Destruction. So it's kind of a step-by-step guide. We talk about the 5 key steps. It's a framework to separation or divorce today. This does not constitute legal advice in any way, shape, or form. I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV. She is only licensed in the state of North Carolina. She is not licensed in other states. So this does not constitute a replacement for legal advice. If you need legal advice on your particular case, I highly recommend you consult an attorney in your state and get support. Get a support team. And we talk about what that support team looks like because we don't want you to walk through that alone. It's emotional. There's a lot of guilt and shame and fear and grief, and getting support and doing your own work in healing around this because it's a trauma is so important. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jamie Davis. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter. I am excited about this topic, not because I'm excited about divorce or separation or any relationship challenges. It's because people are looking for a guide or a framework on how to get through a divorce or a separation. And I'm so excited to have Jamie with us today to walk us through how to go about. She has a 5-step framework on how to divorce. I mean, is that essentially what you've created? And you also have a book that helps you walk through this process.
Yeah, so over my 23 years of experience of helping folks navigate this process of separation and divorce, I have put together a list of really 5 main points to help folks navigate this process and be able to divorce in a more amicable way. I like to call it divorce without destruction. And really, there are 5 main points. Do you want me to get into those now?
Let's jump in and then we can talk about where this leads us. But I think the audience will be curious at what are these 5 points? So I don't have a devastating and destructive divorce.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first main point is how you initiate the separation can really set the tone for the whole process. And so what I mean by that is you need to be prepared, number one. Do some homework. Make sure that you are really ready to proceed with the separation. If you're not sure, if you're on the fence, I really encourage folks to try some couples counseling before they utter those words, I want a separation, because once you say it, you can't take it back. And it really can hinder the process if folks aren't sure and they really may have a chance to work on the marriage. I like them to explore that first. I think that's more helpful. But let's say you're one of those folks who is ready and you've made up your mind and you want to be separated. Do your homework first. Gather any financial documents that you can get your hands on. You're probably going to need those later, especially when you meet with a lawyer. And also just mentally prepare yourself. Start thinking about what your support network is going to look like if you proceed with the separation itself. So that's really point number one. I will say that all of these tips, this framework, really, it's going to depend on the marriage about whether it's going to apply to you because folks have lots of different home lives. And these 5 tips may not be helpful for someone who is in an abusive marriage or where there is a real difference in the power dynamic between the spouses. These may not work for them, but in most marriages, I think these can be helpful tips for trying to navigate a separation and divorce without destruction. So on to tip number 2, assemble a team to support you. And by your team, I mean your therapist, your divorce lawyer, perhaps a divorce coach if you want to go that route, a financial advisor. All of these folks are going to be super helpful to you in your journey of navigating this separation. The third part of the framework is to get clear on what's most important to you and be willing to let go of the rest. Here we're talking about needs versus wants and goal setting. Have a top 3. What are the top 3 things that you're hoping to get out of this separation and divorce? When I am counseling my clients, I always encourage them to think about, if you don't reach an agreement with a spouse, what is the court going to do for you? And the reason behind that is that it is not productive to continue to argue over things that a court couldn't do for you anyway if you end up in court. And one of the big examples that I give is in North Carolina, parents are only obligated to pay child support until their child has turned 18 and has graduated from high school. There is no obligation to pay for college for children in North Carolina. And oftentimes I have clients come in and they say, I really want my ex-spouse to obligate themselves to pay for our kids' college education. I say to them, okay, well, let's take a step back. If your spouse doesn't agree, can the court do this for you? And the answer is no. And so maybe that's one of those points that you just decide to let go of and to focus on the things that the court can do for you. So that's my third part of the framework and third tip for how to have a divorce without destruction. And then point 4, and I can't stress this one enough, if you are in a relationship and you have children, you have to stay focused on what's in the best interest of your children. That should be the main goal here, is to do what is best for them and to not let your own emotions get in the way of decisions that are best for your kids. And finally, the 5th tip here for having a divorce without destruction is to prioritize your own emotional health and self-care. Self-care is crucial when you are going through this process. For many people, this is one of the most stressful times of their lives. A lot of experts liken the emotions of a divorce with a death, and folks are often surprised to learn that they may go through that same grieving process. And so it is critical that you continue to prioritize your own well-being as you go throughout this process, because you're going to get a second chance at a happy life. And you will be in a better position to take advantage of that if throughout this process you are taking care of your own mental health.
That is the truth of the truth of the truth. Can't emphasize that enough. I love these 5 kind of step framework that you've outlined. I think you've hit all the most important pieces. A lot of clients will come in and go, well, what are my separation options? What different options do people have for a separation? I've heard many different terms for different types of separation.
That's a great question. So first of all, I'm not going to give any legal advice, but my suggestions and discussion of the law are limited to North Carolina because that's the only state in which I'm licensed. But here in North Carolina, in order to be legally separated, you actually have to live under separate roofs with the intent of at least one of you that the separation be permanent to be considered legally separated. And there's actually case law. It's interesting that even different sides of a duplex are not good enough. You have to be physically in separate residences with different addresses with the intent of one of you that the separation be permanent. So if you're in a situation where you and your spouse are still living together, but somebody is sleeping on the couch, you are not legally separated here in North Carolina.
We call that an in-house separation. It's not really a legal term, right? We're just kind of putting boundaries around what the boundaries will look like if we live in the same home. There's not a legal opportunity for separation if you're living in the same home. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct in North Carolina.
Okay. And so some people would talk about the benefits of separation, like, oh, it freezes the assets. So no one can go and charge up a credit card or clean out a bank account. What are the benefits to a legal separation?
So there are many benefits. You're right. The date of separation, we say that we take a snapshot of the marital estate. And what that means is that the date of separation is the day that we're going to be using to value all of the things that the couple acquired while they were married. The marital home, cars, bank accounts, retirement, all of the things. And we typically create a spreadsheet, and it has a list of all the assets, and it has a column for each spouse. And we just go down the spreadsheet, putting the value of the thing in the column of the spouse who's going to receive it. And here in North Carolina, at the end of the day, what one spouse gets should equal what the other spouse gets. And so by legally separating, you're right, you avoid getting stuck with your other spouse's credit card debt that he or she ran up following the separation. That's going to be their separate debt, not yours. And also, let's say that you are the employed spouse and you are continuing to make contributions to a retirement account. By legally separating, any of those contributions you make following separation, those are going to be yours. Those are not going to be marital and subject to division, because income earned by a party following that date of separation is the separate money of the person who earned it.
Okay. This is why it's so important to have that support team that you were talking about and that information gathering, because this is all new information. And here in Indiana, we have like mediators, different type of mediation. Can you explain to the audience like the levels? Like you can do mediation, then you can do separation, you can do divorce. Like people have a hard time understanding the options.
So in my experience, mediation is a wonderful way for separating spouses to resolve these outstanding issues, such as child custody, the division of assets. Is somebody going to pay spousal support? Is somebody going to pay child support? Mediation can be very, very helpful. And the way that it works here, if lawyers are involved, is that I would be in one room with my client. Another lawyer would be in a separate room with the opposing party. And the mediator, who is a neutral third person, usually with a lot of years of family law experience, goes back and forth between the rooms, trying to help the folks reach a compromise if they can. Oftentimes with family law mediations, we don't put the parties in the same room because we don't find that to be very productive. But the process itself is very, very helpful in getting these cases resolved. The beauty of mediation, too, is that it can happen before the people are legally separated, or it can happen after. In fact, here in North Carolina, there are certain claims that you are required to attend mediation before you can have a final court hearing. Equitable distribution, which is our division of property between separated spouses, you are required to attend mediation before you can have a court hearing on equitable distribution. So mediation can be a very helpful process really at any time, either before or after. We have mediation, and then also in other cases, there is arbitration, which some folks choose to use. In that case, the third party is actually able to make decisions like a judge. You are contractually agreeing that this third person is going to be the decider in your case. So instead of appearing in a courtroom in front of a judge, you present your case just like you're in court, but it's to this arbitrator who is eventually going to give you an arbitration award and make the same types of decisions that a judge would, but you are avoiding court in that instance as well.
And then we have a term called collaborative attorney. We have so many options. This is what confuses clients because they're like, I don't know, there's collaborative attorney, there's mediation, there's arbitration, there's divorce attorneys. Tell us about a collaborative attorney.
Yeah, you're right. It really is choose your own adventure in these cases. Collaborative law is a different subset. Lawyers have to be collaboratively trained. I am not a lawyer in the specific sense of the term, but that doesn't mean I can't get a case settled, right? So in collaborative law, what the two spouses are agreeing is that they are going to try to resolve their issues outside of court and that they are going to engage in a process where they have each hired collaborative lawyers to try to get the case settled. But if they can't get it settled and they do find the need to go to court, they are each required to hire new lawyers to help them with that litigation process. I do believe there are some cases where collaborative law can be very, very helpful, but I do think it is a very specific type of case. I think in cases where there is high conflict or there is a real difference in the power dynamic, one of the spouses holds a lot more, whether it's financial or other power over the other spouse, those cases may not be right for collaborative.
I'm glad you said that because I think that's a key distinction because these have to be pretty, I would say, they get along fairly well. They can talk about things and work through things, and they're able to manage their defensiveness. Because what I find with clients is this can be a long process. I mean, for some clients, this can go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. How do you help people manage the length of time? Because it's like an emotional roller coaster for clients. How do you help people manage that time effectively? Does that make sense? Because I feel like this is taking a lot, for some, it takes a long time for separation or divorce.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it can take years. It should not. That is the rare case, but it can. And so when a client first comes to me, one of the first things I say to them is baby steps. There can be a tendency to spin out of control and the anxiety, right? Like they're anxious, they're not feeling like they're in control of their own life. And so they're newly separated, they're thinking about separation, and they're worried about what their custodial schedule is going to be for next Christmas. And so what I try to encourage them to do is, okay, well, let's not look that far in the future. Let's think about today. What issues do we need to worry about? Do you have enough money to get this month's bills paid? Do you know where your children are going to be this weekend? Have you guys figured out the schedule for now? And so I try to get them to focus on tasks that are much sooner in time and to not get lost in the big picture of what's going to happen a year from now. Another thing that I think is really important to try to cope with the length of time that these cases can take is your support system and your team of professionals that you've hired to help you. This is where they come in and they can really support you through this process and keep you focused on what's important. Again, your therapist, your coach, all of those folks are critical in navigating the length of time the process takes.
Yes. And I think it can tap into some kind of inner child work for some folks, like the feeling of abandonment, the feeling of rejection, the feeling of I'll never be loved again, I'll never find a partner again, I'll be alone for the rest of my life. What damage, and this is the word they use, what the damage our children will face. This is one of the biggest concerns I hear from clients is the impact on children. How do you help clients navigate? That was one of your points, is that put the children first. And I say that all the time. Make every decision based on what's best for the children. Really, truly, because that is something we are responsible for. How do you help them emotionally navigate the fear they have about the impact on the kids?
Well, I think there are a couple different ways. So first, there are the clients who feel terribly guilty for separating in the first place, and they feel like they are ruining their children's lives by just the act of separating. And what I try to encourage those folks to think about is that during the marriage, they didn't get along with their spouse, and their child was often exposed to arguing and yelling and fighting, and that they were modeling marriage to their child. And do they want their child to end up in a marriage like they were in? And if the answer is no, it may be better for the child to grow up in two houses, but two happy houses where the parents are healthy and there is no yelling and arguing and fighting. So I think that is step number one. The other thing I tell folks is that you control a lot of this. And you are in charge of your emotions and you are the grown-up. And it is up to you to put those emotions in a box when you are in front of your child. And it can be really hard to do. I am not suggesting that this is an easy thing to do because, again, going through a separation and divorce is an extremely emotional and stressful time. But as a parent, it is your job to protect your child. And you often hear parents say, well, I'm not going to lie to my child. They need to know what the other spouse did to me. Well, no, they don't. Perhaps in the future when it's age appropriate to tell them certain things you can, but they certainly do not need to know every detail that led to the separation and the divorce. So it really is up to the parents to protect the child and to shield them from the legal activities that are going on while the case is progressing.
I think that's an important point because what some parents can feel so dysregulated and so alone and so rejected and just not good enough. And soothing that part that feels maybe rejection or guilt that they've made a decision. Because sometimes marriages, they never fought. Like they just never fought, but they didn't deal with anything. So they didn't fight. So it didn't look like it was like a bad relationship, but underneath it, there was no connection. There was no conversations. And so we say, is that a healthy relationship? Well, no, because we want connection and communication. And I think there's this soothing of the parent, and then we don't want to triangulate the kids into picking sides or oversharing because we're dysregulated and we're needing support. That's not their job, is what I hear you saying. That's not our kids' job, is to provide us emotional support. We are there to meet them. That's why doing your own work is so incredibly helpful, because you get to be the parent, the best version of yourself in this process. So you are there emotionally for your kids. That's the most important part of this process, is you're getting the support so then you can offer the support to your kids. Because I find sometimes if there's been an affair or a betrayal or something along those lines, that the parent can feel very upset if the child has a relationship with the person that had the affair. And I'm like, that's where you go to therapy. That's where you have a support group. That's where you're dealing. So you're not putting that on the child, like making the child feel bad that they have a relationship with their other parent. Do you find that's a challenge at times for clients?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, cases where there has been adultery or an affair can be the most difficult cases to settle just because of that betrayal and lack of trust. And it's really important for the person who has been cheated on to remember your child is both of you, right? Your child is part you and part your spouse. And when you speak negatively about the child's other parent, you're really speaking negatively about the child, and your child is going to internalize that. And so try to remember, I know it's really, really hard, but that your spouse may have cheated on you, but that doesn't take away from their ability to parent the child necessarily, right? Like your spouse doesn't become a bad mom or dad just because they cheated. And that's something else I tell my clients too, is that adultery is not the cause of a bad marriage, it's a symptom. And there was something else going on that led to the cheating that wasn't being worked out, right? Like there was some underlying issue that needed to be addressed that wasn't. And so to the extent, again, that you can shield the child from these very adult issues, that's going to be what's best for your child.
And meet them emotionally with what they're grappling with, because they're going to have grief. You have grief. You've got to work through your own grief. They're going to have major grief and fear. And the other piece I think is important is to make sure the child knows it's not their fault. Because inadvertently, a child can say, well, I must have done something, or I caused this, or I was a bad kid, and internalize that they're responsible for mom's emotions, dad's emotions, and the divorce. Do you find that working with clients?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so important that you just let the child be a child. They should not have to worry about making sure mom is okay, making sure dad is okay. Like that's where putting on that brave face, even when you don't want to, is really important. Your child is going through a transition as well. They're having to learn how to live in two houses. You're not, right? Like you get to stay put in most cases in your home. I mean, there are some situations where folks do nesting, and we can talk more about that. But in most cases, it's not the parent going back and forth, it's the child. And the child is undergoing this huge life change. And so to the extent that you can support them in that change, it's certainly better for the child.
Yeah, I agree. Tell us about nesting. You mentioned that term, so people might not know what that is. Can you share what that is and then the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So nesting is a situation where the children remain in the marital home, but the parents cycle in and out for their custodial time with the child. And so what I mean by that is if the child is living in the home, maybe mom lives in the home with the child on Monday and Tuesdays, and then she leaves and goes somewhere else. Dad lives in the home Wednesday and Thursday, and then the parents alternate the weekends with the child. And so nesting can be a short-term solution, I think, in some cases. Again, it requires a certain level of trust because separated folks are cycling in and out of the same home. And so if you're concerned that your spouse is going to go through your things or do something to break your trust while they're in the home, nesting may not be the best solution for you. It does provide stability for the children, which is a great solution. But long term, in my experience, nesting doesn't really work in the long term just because it's really critical for folks to have their own space. And I often see disputes arise like, who's paying for the groceries? How much of the electric bill are you responsible for? Who's going to clean the bathroom, right? Like very basic things that when you're living together as a married couple, you've already decided upon that division of labor. But when you're nesting, it can be more difficult, and folks can start using those types of things to get at the other parent, right? Like, oh, I'm going to not clean up the mess I made in the kitchen just to try to get back at the other spouse.
Yeah, those are great points on both sides. I rarely recommend it just because there might be a situation, but I find that it ends up feeling similar dynamic, like you said, because you're still having to figure out, like you made some great points on who's going to clean and who's responsible for this. So it can get blurry. Like you said, it'd probably be a rare case that it would work out, not to say it couldn't. What do you think are the biggest challenges when it comes to separation? Like, what would you say are the biggest challenges people face?
I think it depends on the case, and I think it depends on the reason for the separation. Like I mentioned earlier, when infidelity is an issue, it can make a separation more challenging. In the current economic climate, one of the big challenges we're seeing is that whoever is going to stay in the marital home, in most cases, they're required to refinance the mortgage. Interest rates are through the roof. And so while they may have been able to afford that home during the marriage, now that they're separated and they're going to be required to refinance, it's much harder for them to do that. Also, another thing that can make a separation very difficult is if there is just not enough money to go around. If during the marriage you were barely making ends meet, if you separate and are trying to fund two different households, it can be extremely difficult to do. And so those can all be challenging. Also, if parents have very different parenting styles and they didn't discuss that really during the marriage, maybe one parent was just more responsible for the parenting than the other. When these folks separate, they tend to butt heads a little bit more over what the custody schedule should look like and what rules should be in place about co-parenting the child.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I find that if they already had frustration in the marriage, sometimes it's highlighted even more when they're separated because they're functioning like a child and they want to get back at me over things. And it's like a game. And well, this is how it was in the marriage, but yet it feels more amplified sometimes when because you don't have your kids the whole time. They have the kids part of the time and the other parent does. I find that can be a challenge for the parent that doesn't want to really give up custody and struggles with a new person. Maybe the partner finds they start dating again. Do you find that as another challenge?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there is this tendency, I think, in those cases to want to micromanage the other parent's time. And typically in these custody cases, the day-to-day decisions of child rearing are simply made by the parent who has custody of the child. These are not the major decisions that parents need to discuss and agree on. And it can be very, very hard for a parent to let go of those things if they are used to being in charge of them.
Yes, I find that's very challenging. Emotionally, it's just hard. And when they don't have their kids, and then sometimes they feel like, well, I'm getting a break and that's nice, but they struggle with that piece. How important is it to really be clear on legal joint custody and physical joint custody versus you could have physical, but you don't have legal custody? Can you explain those differences and nuances?
Yeah, absolutely. So legal custody is the ability of parents to make decisions for their child. And I would say in most cases, unless there is some reason why one parent is unfit for joint legal custody, parents do have joint legal custody. And what that means is that they are required to discuss and mutually agree upon major decisions affecting the welfare of the child. Typically, those major decisions are things like education, where will the child go to school, medical decisions, who will the child's doctor be, therapy, does the child need to see a therapist, and if so, who? And so in most cases, parents have the ability to make those decisions jointly. In North Carolina, we have something called a parenting coordinator, and that's a person who can be appointed to be the tiebreaker and make those decisions in high conflict cases when the parents can't agree on those decisions. I actually do some work as a parenting coordinator myself, and those can be some of the more challenging cases where you're really kind of like a third parent in the situation. And, if mom and dad can't agree on where the child goes to school, sometimes I'm making that decision about where their child goes to school. So that's very different than physical custody, which is where the child lives and when. So really, when we're talking about physical custody, we're just talking about that custody schedule and whose house the child is at.
As therapists, we run into that we need to see the legal documents because they might say we have joint legal custody, but they really don't. And so we have to make sure we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's, because we can get in situations where the child doesn't want the other parent to know they're in therapy because they feel like they don't feel safe with that parent. They feel like they're emotionally, things are used as weaponized. And we run this line, right, of we have to legally, if they have joint legal custody, the parent has to sign off on their therapy if they're under 18.
Right.
It's a challenge because if that child, and that's where like a CASA or a parenting coordinator comes in if need be to help navigate. But some people don't have that. They don't have a parenting coordinator. And bless you for doing that. First of all, I want to say that is not for the faint of heart. Oh my gosh. That really, because you get pulled into every email, right? I mean, you have to, like, you're CC'd on all these decisions, right? As a parenting coordinator.
Yeah, you can be. And what I say to my PC clients is, you're not always going to agree with my decision. Your spouse is not going to agree with my decision, but I will always err on the side of making the decision that brings peace for your child.
And I love that. Because I think when the child is trying to voice an opinion and they're trying to say, I don't feel safe with this parent, we can do so much, but legally we have to have the parent, like one of the parent will be like, well, I don't want the other parent to know they're in therapy. Well, that's a challenge because you have joint legal custody. And so we have to know the other parent has to sign off on it. So that's a challenge on our end that we see. Do you find you're getting called for those types of things where the one parent doesn't want to tell the other parent something?
Yes, or one parent just doesn't believe the child needs therapy. And so I've seen cases where a child has gotten into therapy and one parent has figured it out and then they revoke their consent. And then the poor child is left not having a therapist to see. And then there's this lag time, which is certainly not in the child's best interest at all.
Yes. And that's why that is one of your top 5 framework pieces is the child. All decisions have to be made based on the interest of the child. Let's talk about emotions when it comes to separation and divorce, because that can take over because you're going through so much grief and loss, and it's scary, and you feel guilty, and you feel shame, and there's so many different emotions. Like you said, it's like a death. How do you help people navigate? They have their support system, but as an attorney, how do you help people navigate those emotions so they're making sound decisions?
So that can be really, really challenging. And here is where I encourage folks to focus on their own self-care and to have a really good relationship with their therapist. I'm able to make a lot of decisions for my clients when it comes to legal strategy, procedure, those sorts of things. But there are certain decisions I can't make for them. I can't tell them what custody schedule is going to be in the best interest of their particular children. I can't tell them whether or not they're willing to accept a certain amount of spousal support or whether certain assets are part of their marital estate. I don't know those things. I can't make those decisions for them. I can give them some advice about those things, but at the end of the day, it's their children and their money, and I need them to be mentally healthy enough to be able to make these really tough decisions. And so, again, self-care, I can't stress it enough. And if that means you see a therapist, that's what you do.
Yes, I think the therapist is key. If everybody had, I see that if, let's say, and this is not always the case, but ideally, both parents are in therapy. I find those divorces go so much better because they're doing their own work, they're self-aware, they're making more clear decisions, they're processing their grief and starting over. And then they're rumbling through. One of them might have to get a job. Maybe they were a stay-at-home parent and they've got to get a job now. And so they feel resentful. They feel sad. They feel scared. Sometimes you have to get, I'm hearing you say, like, to pay the mortgage, you might have to get a job if you didn't have a job. Maybe you had a part-time job, or maybe you did, or a stay-at-home parent. Do you find that's hard for folks when they have to get a job?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I hear a lot. It was our plan that I was going to stay home with the children and my spouse was going to work. And I've given up years of my career. There's no way I can get back in the job force right now, right? Like, I've been out of a job for 10, 15, 20 years. And those can be really tough discussions to have with folks. Also, something else that I try to remind my clients of is that, except for custody, I'm not talking about custody, but the financial portions of a case, you really need to look at it like it's a business decision. You have to put those emotions in a box and say, okay, am I making the decision that's best for my financial future? A lot of folks want to keep that marital home. I know we talked about this earlier, but the marital home can be a money pit in terms of upkeep and taxes, maintenance, all of the things. And so you really need to be sure, do you want that marital home because it's financially best for you, or do you just want that marital home because of the memories that it holds and you feel like it's home to you?
Yeah, and that's hard. I mean, and sometimes staying in the home is cheaper. Depends on where you live and the situation and all that. So you're right. You have to navigate if it makes sense for you to do that or not. And then there's loss for you and the kids because that's the home maybe they grew up in or they were in for the last several years. And processing that with the kids is really important. And naming it as grief is really important, I think, with the kids. I want to talk a little bit about your book in case someone says,
Sure.
I love what she's sharing. I kind of feel lost. I feel drained. I don't know where to start. Tell us about your book and what you cover in your book.
Yeah, so my book is called A Year and a Day, Divorce Without Destruction. Back in 2017, I actually started my own podcast with the same name. And the book is based on various episodes of the podcast. I just felt like the guests that were on the show and the wisdom they shared needed to be shared with a broader audience. And so I decided to write some of it down. Really, I find it to be a practical guide to going through divorce and some of the bigger areas that you will encounter. There's chapters about what to do before you separate. There's other chapters about what is equitable distribution? What does that look like? I'm going through a custody case. Do you need some tips? And then I finished the book with self-care because, like I've mentioned several times, I think self-care is crucial to this process. So the title itself, A Year and a Day, in North Carolina, spouses have to be separated for a year and a day, and that's when they are eligible to file for divorce. So really, the book is covering all of those things that you need to be thinking about during that year before you file for your divorce.
Yeah, I like that title because that captures everything. I think when we look at divorce and we look at separation, it's a chapter ending. And to talk about it, like, let's not sweep it under the rug with the kids and make it bypass like sunshine and roses. It's all going to be great. And then ask if they have specific questions. I recommend answering where am I going to live? Where am I going to go to school? Is it important to have those decisions kind of figured out before you tell the kids? Tell me what your opinion is on that.
Yeah, so obviously I am not a child psychologist, but in my dealings with other child psychologists and the best way to approach these situations, my understanding is that it is good to have a concrete plan before you tell the kids anything. In a lot of cases, we actually encourage folks to speak with a child psychologist about the best way to tell the children about the separation.
Yes, I think it's super helpful to get that counsel as part of this, your 5-step plan with the team. That needs to be part of your team. And then I encourage people, if the child is having emotions and needs support, that they have a therapist, a play therapist, depending on how young they are, that they have a therapist that understands what goes on in a divorce and separation and how it impacts the kids, that they have a safe person to talk to, a neutral person that can support them. I think that is so helpful. And not every kid needs it, but I think it's important to have some resources lined up before you tell your kids.
Oh, absolutely. That is wonderful advice.
Yes. Is there anything we didn't cover that you think is important for people to know?
Really, I think we've covered it in terms of the framework to having a divorce without destruction. But if I had to add something else, I would just say make sure that you prepare and plan for the separation before you let the cat out of the bag and mention it to your spouse. Even have a consultation with an attorney first before you talk about the separation. You don't have to hire the lawyer if you don't want to, but at least have a consultation with an attorney in your state so that you know what you're entitled to if you decide to separate.
That's exactly what I tell clients. I said, get information. Information is empowering for you to help make sense of what your options are and to get clarity, because it seems like you're in a fog and the guilt and the shame can kind of take over and then you can feel lost. So I think that's great advice. I am so grateful for you, Jamie. Jamie Davis, thank you. Go grab her book. And I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with our audience. And hopefully we can have you back on another time and break down maybe even before you get a divorce and what that entails, like what to get in line, because we didn't hit that as much before you separate. So thank you so, so much.
Oh, Kristen, thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation and I've loved speaking with you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, KRISTEN, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.